I'll just start with a really quick joke. It's a pretty bad joke, but it's after lunch, and so I figure this is appropriate. So this woman dies, goes to heaven. She meets St. Peter at the gates. St. Peter says, "Welcome to heaven. You made it in, but there's just one last test for you." She says, "What's that?" And he says, "Well, you have to spell a word." And she says, "Well, what word?" And he says, "Any word." So she says, "Love." And he says, "Fantastic job. You made it to heaven. Oh, but there's one other task. The next person who comes, I need for you to do the same thing for them, give them the same instructions." Next person comes, turns out it's her ex-husband. She says, "What are you doing here?" He's just as surprised. And he says, "Well, welcome to heaven. You made it in. There's one task that you have to pass." And he says, "What's that?" And she says, "You have to spell a word." And he says, "Oh, what word?" And she says, "Schizotypy." So one of the things we did, Adam led a team of, Adam and Ollie both led a team of us doing research on causality perception in Afghanistan and the US. So this is not a data talk. I want to talk a little bit actually about the challenges that we faced in the field. And the idea here is this may be have some relevance to some of the work that you've done or are planning to do, or that you know of others doing across cultures that may be of interest in the field of religious cognition. I also really want to thank the Templeton Foundation for supporting this conference. I think this is a really fantastic gathering. And I'm a long time admirer of the Templeton Foundation. I'm not giving that flattery lightly. I was 8 years old, and I remember reading the Templeton Foundation newsletter about big ideas in religion. And it's hard to make any 8-year-old, I think, pay attention for more than a few seconds to anything. So this is not a data talk. A couple of the posters you may have seen in there with these two handsome and perfect. These two good chaps. This is Natalie and Adam, and they just presented a couple of posters on some of the exciting findings that we've found from the research in Afghanistan. I don't want to go into too much detail there, but I do want you to be familiar a little bit with the nature of the research. So Adam began with a general question, and Adam is full of questions. If you hang around him for about more than 5 minutes, it's infectious. He'll give you one. So the major question generally is, do believers and non-believers actually see the world or perceive the world differently? And this is one sort of illustration of that. Let me see if I can play this. Sorry, no, this is an illustration of one of the tasks in the study. So a question, do you see a causal relationship between these two? Yes or no? Yes? This is obviously a general, here we are, getting this technology down. How about now? Yeah? And now? How about now? So this is called the Michaud launching task, and it's a nice measure of individual differences in causal perception. Some people are maybe more affected by the amount of time the two balls are touching, and others may be observing something else about the relationship. But we break this down and compare it to other measures, a series of other measures, and we're looking at this as an outcome variable, as well as in some cases a predictor variable. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but this is, again, I just want to give some representations of the tasks that we used, and I'm going to explain why this is relevant in a minute. This is another task where we ask people to take and drag one circle onto another to visually represent how much God intervenes in their life. It's a visual task. Another task is a picture of a car and a person near it, and we tell a story about what happens, and then we ask them to literally click on the point in the screen where they think God's power is in that story or that event. So the team here consists of Adam, this handsome fellow over here, Ollie, Natalie and Adam, who you see over here. And then the idea was, after an initial pilot of some of these measures to study causality perception and religious cognition in the US, to also test this in Afghanistan and to see if some of the same findings would hold true. And I've been working in Afghanistan now for about 12 years, and doing research, so it's a pretty accessible environment. So we put together an Afghan team, and we decided to attempt these measures, which are shown for you as sort of a laboratory-based, computer-based set of measures, and we conducted the same thing in Afghanistan. And of course, doing something across such a diverse set of contexts is inevitably going to present some challenges, but also some learning opportunities. The assumptions, of course, in doing cross-cultural research broadly, for us are that the methods can be reasonably replicated so that you're testing, by assumption, the substantively similar things across contexts, and that any sort of consistency or inconsistency across those contexts then would be instructive, somehow meaningful, or tell us something about the nature of relationships between the variables. And of course, we're weird people looking at other people. Weird, I'm sure some of you are already familiar with as an acronym: Western, educated, industrialized, democratic, rich. And so this was a term coined by some researchers back in 2009. And they mentioned, at least at that time, that a review of studies suggested that 96% of subjects in behavioral science studies that they looked at met these criteria. They were in weird countries or civilizations, or however you want to phrase that. Overemphasis generally on college students and on people in the US. With all due respect to people who are coming from England here. So non-weird, presumably then, is a person from a non-Western country, which is somewhat hard to imagine in a globalized context, since the Western culture is a bit everywhere and other culture is also in the West, but less educated in certain forms of Western education, less industrialized, poorer, however you want to measure poverty, less developed. And a bonus for us in looking at Afghanistan, of course, is there's religious differentiation. And I think that looking at religion across contexts is quite challenging, because if you were to gather a group of Muslims in America, for example, and you wanted to study them, inevitably they're going to be quite different from a group of Muslims from Afghanistan, because the normative context is different. In Afghanistan, everybody is Muslim, whereas here, maybe those beliefs are more by choice, maybe there are other variables influencing them. So broadly speaking, we know, though, that Afghanistan is sort of non-Western, high levels of illiteracy, and high levels of insecurity in particular. So I just want to go over a couple of these. I also want to note that very, very few people in Afghanistan have access to television or the internet, although this is increasingly used. And the exposure to this in the outside world really makes an impact on a lot of different perceptions. It's also quite new to survey research generally, and people find this somewhat amusing when people ask them strange questions they've never thought of before. And we know that insecurity has been increasing in its context of rising insecurity. So by comparison, this is a measure of how people are, how often they're afraid for their personal safety. In 2007, compared to 2016, you just generally see a worsening. So that inevitably is going to affect some of their perceptions and attitudes, and also their sensitivities. And in our research in particular, we were asking questions about religion in a context where saying that you're an atheist or that you don't believe in God can be punishable by death or just social alienation or other sorts of consequences. So that means we had to be very cautious. But one of the things that surprised us was that the researchers in many cases were more afraid for safety, their own safety, than the participant safety. Participants in many cases can just point to the researchers and say they're doing something haram or wrong, and the researcher will be in trouble, not the participant so much. There's also a risk that, given the conservative norms, that we stumble on some norm in the incorrect way and step on somebody's toes. We spent a lot of time on cross-cultural validation of the instruments. We did things like we did gender matching for the interviewers and the respondents. And we spent a lot of time translating and back-translating the measures. and along the way, stumbling along the many things and assumptions that we didn't realize. So, for example, a reference in a schizotypy scale to flying saucers doesn't fly, so to speak, in Afghanistan. Or a reference to records only applies if you're aware of something called a record. Some general observations, I think, that are of interest here are that the types of measures that we used aren't tailor-made for Afghanistan. And that's true of a lot of different measures in cross-cultural research, right? It's the difference between a sort of store-bought suit versus a tailor-made suit that's built for your body. And we also found that people were a little bit unfamiliar with the use of these computers. And maybe that affected some of their responses, and we're not quite sure. We're still sort of exploring that exactly. One of the biggest problems was the lower level of comprehension. So a question with multiple parts or hypothetical introduced a whole another level of variance and complication. One of the tests that we used was the mental rotations task, for example. This was very difficult for people, in many cases frustrating. Another thing we found was that the longer the sets of measures became, the more we found there's a decrease in variance and an overall sense of cognitive load. So people were exhausted by the end. And so we introduced breaks along the way to try to pace things through. Some other things we did to kind of troubleshoot, we shifted from towards a more convenience snowball sampling. We found that people were more willing to bring a friend into the study, especially if there was some small remuneration in this context. But that also added more challenges in terms of supervision. And one thing that we do in the future is have more supervision. It's challenging when, so in this case, we started in a laboratory and then we shifted towards the end of the study to people's homes, and the researchers would go to people's homes one-on-one. But then you need a supervisor to go with them. Of course, you need then a gender-matched supervisor, and it becomes complicated in a variety of different ways. But trust and relationships really become key when you're doing this sort of sensitive research, as many of you already know. We also focused on more secure populations there. In this case, Hazara populations who are Shia generally are more pro-Western and safer. There's just less risk to us. We did find some pushback. I'll just very briefly mention a couple of the incidents. And one of the incidents was a response from a local cleric who reached out to a researcher and said, we don't approve of what you're doing. We know what you're doing. You're clearly asking these strange questions that were introduced by Westerners. At least that was sort of the gist of it. And we don't approve of it. And the cleric then said, we'd like to see the letter of permission that you have to conduct this sort of research from the government. And so the researcher's response was, well, I'd love to show you the letter of permission, but I need a letter of permission from you or from some other body, maybe the Ministry of Interior, stating that you have permission to receive my letter of permission. But there's just a general sense of distrust and paranoia around anyone doing anything remotely associated with a religion in Afghanistan, if it's associated with a Westerner. This is a second example of the risk of security, and the way that affected us was we conducted a separate study on, or not a study, but a separate provision of training in data analysis and research methods as a way of trying to engage young researchers in the scientific method. And so this is the classroom where we conducted 2 of the classes. It was at the Asia Foundation office in Kabul. At first, we asked the American University of Afghanistan if they would allow us to teach it there, and they refused, given the nature that they expected there might be some religious questions that we might ask or engage, and they wanted to stay away from that. The Asia Foundation agreed, provided that we didn't study or get into any kind of religious questions. So we could talk about the scientific method, but we couldn't get into anything remotely related to religion. This is the same building, same classroom that after the recent attack this week. So the fear of insecurity is quite real and experienced here. The bomb was happened en route to the building, and it shattered the windows. So when people are afraid of safety, it's a very, very physical, real fear. the question, of course, is when you have rising insecurity, how does that fear affect people's responses to a variety of measures? It certainly increases social desirability bias, where they're less likely to be open. It increases maybe the need for more indirect measures, like you've seen in this conference here. But those indirect measures can need to be tempered a bit by challenges of low education, low levels of exposure to the standardized tests that we're more used to. So something where there are more visuals and something simpler, generally we find, are more effective. Here's an example from the Afghan survey, from a different survey. This is a national survey, where we present a picture of different women with different dress, and we say, which of these women is most appropriately dressed for public? People find this very, very easy to answer. Whereas if we ask this in a 1 to 5 scale, people don't understand what 1 means or what 5 means. And by the time we get to from strongly disagree to strongly agree, they've already forgotten what the middle options are, and it becomes more difficult. This is particularly challenging because illiteracy is very high, over 70%. So the more visuals and the more there's an active, involved researcher in walking the respondent through, the better. So before summing up, I really want to plug the journal that we have, a special edition coming out for the APA journal, Peace and Psychology. And if you have an idea of anything on religious cognition that could be relevant to peace and conflict, I hope that you'll consider submitting an abstract. So I won't plug any more than that, except to say that if you haven't considered it, please do. We'll be collecting abstracts soon. And many thanks to the Templeton Foundation for this.
Okay, so it's now my honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Nicholas Gibson. And Nick is Senior Program Officer in Human Sciences at the John Templeton Foundation. He has degrees from Oxford and from Cambridge, where he received a PhD in the psychology of religion, where he also had a faculty position before coming to Templeton. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that perhaps more than anyone else, Nick's vision in concert with Kimon of what the study of religious cognition is and should become is really shaping and driving progress in this research space. And it's a vision, I think it's worth saying, that appeals not only to people who consider themselves first scholars of religion. I think it's a vision that appeals by design and draws in folks like me who actually are interested first in how thinking works, how the kinds of mental and neural processes that make us human actually happen, and a kind of vision that challenges us to say, well, how might those processes, how might those same systems underlie belief? And so I know all of us are keen to hear what Nick views as kind of the next important questions and the next steps that need to be taken. So please join me in welcoming Nick.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for coming to this event. I didn't know when Adam was organizing it that it would be as large as this, and I'm really encouraged by the enthusiasm of people to come to a meeting, even a one-day meeting. I know many of you have traveled a long way to come here to think about cognition and belief. There we are. Something blew up on my screen. So. Adam asked me to talk about priority questions for advancing inquiry into the cognition of belief. I'm a little bit wary about telling you what I think the right questions to study are, in part because we've already heard lots of really good questions, many more good questions in the posters, and this is kind of what scholars do, right? You get to the end of your article and you have 3 things in your discussion that say, and here's what we should do next, and then no one does it. And so big questions are kind of a dime a dozen, it seems to me. So here's a Religion, Brain, and Behavior. They're about to come out with a special issue on big questions in the scientific study of religion. They call them Hilbert problems after a mathematician. And there's 17 interesting big questions in there. And some of us wrote commentaries on those. And one of my observations was, if these questions are really worth doing, wouldn't people apply for funding to go do them? So I did a search of all the grant requests that we had got in scientific study of religion over the last few years, and it was hundreds of letters of intent. And most of the things people were saying are worth doing, no one was asking for money to do those things. So that's just curious to me, and I'd welcome your ideas on how, and your grant proposals on why people are not necessarily applying for funding to do the things that they think are interesting and worth doing. But with that sort of caveat, then I want to look at maybe some kind of higher level big questions and priorities, things that I would like to see grant proposals on. And so the first is where Adam started, this idea of what is belief made of? I like that turn of phrase. I've been thinking, what's the nature of belief? And we can approach this from several different perspectives. So one is to think about cognitive architectures, which most people studying religion don't seem to think about. So Miguel gestured towards some of these, and some others did as well. This is a sort of typical chart of different of these dual level models of cognition presented, explicit versus implicit, or fast versus slow. And people sometimes are a bit more sophisticated and think about this distinction between computation or processing versus representation. But it's not clear to me that the things in these 2 columns are all the same within a column as each other. Is everything that is implicit intuitive? Is everything that is automatic unconscious? I'm not sure that's the case at all. And so how do these sort of models, and maybe more sophisticated models of cognitive architecture that are just worth developing outside of the study of religion, how might those be imported to think about religious cognition and religious belief? Another approach to what are beliefs made of is to think about affect in relation to belief. And you'll notice nowhere on this list, I guess there it is, affect-free and highly affective. And certainly that cold-hot distinction is not the same as explicit versus implicit. It might be, but it doesn't have to be the same. So what about the role of affect? People haven't mentioned that very much, and so here's 3 specific examples of work that could be done on affect and belief. So one is to think about emotions directed toward gods, toward supernatural agents, and how those might differ from emotions directed toward other people. So what are the cognitive processes involved in gratitude toward God, or gratitude toward the universe, or some sort of mindless force, like we thought about briefly this morning? How does that differ from gratitude toward somebody else? Now, there are some belief processes going on in there. People are having to attribute something to the action of a supernatural agent of some sort, but what are they doing when they're making these supernatural attributions? And wouldn't an understanding of what's going on in that sort of supernatural attribution have something to offer back to a general theory of attribution and how humans do causal attribution? So gratitude is one example. You might not want to apply to do that because we've just given a grant to somebody to do that, but there's many others. So love, or awe, or anger, or guilt, or shame, or fear. So people do experience these emotions toward God or toward other sorts of supernatural agents, but we don't know what's going on when they do it, by and large. Another example might be a person's perceptions of God or God's dispositions toward them. So, is God mad at me? How do I figure that out? What's the sort of causal evidence I'm looking for when making that attribution of, does God love me? How do I know? I talked with Neil briefly earlier about the sort of search that a teenager might make in terms of thinking about, does she love me or not? And what sort of evidence are they relying on in terms of making that judgment? What's going on for religious believers? We thought a lot about beliefs in the existence of supernatural agents and beliefs in beliefs about the sort of causal properties of those, but what about beliefs in places or the afterlife? How does belief in heaven differ from belief in Australia, if you've never been to Australia? How might eschatological hope, to bring the affect into it, be distinguished from hope or optimism? If you don't know what eschatological hope is, it's not the end of the world. Actually, it is. So for the person who really believes that this is not all there is, that there is something beyond this life, might that have some influence on their behavior that we could detect? And why has no one studied this? At least, if you know of anyone who has, please let me know, because I have found, I think, one poster on PsycInfo that has ever looked at anything like this. So affect and belief, and just trying to get at the nature of belief, the things that make up belief. To just pursue this a little bit further, I see a lot of psychology of religion studies. Actually, I'll get to that. I won't skip ahead. So here's a second thought. How do we measure belief? This is really tough, right? You can ask people, have your Likert scale of belief in God, and people have begun using something like that as their dependent variable. So these sorts of studies, does analytical thinking make you believe in God less? Well, I know one or two of you in this room have done some things like this. I'm not sure what is being measured. Okay, something's being pushed around, but what's actually being measured? Does that person really believe in God less at that moment? Does that mean they'd be less likely to pray? How long does that effect last for? Is it just that God is less salient at that moment? Is there some sort of demand characteristic going on? Other sort of potential explanations for what's happening? I'm not sure, and I'd like to know more. I'd like to understand more about what it is that we're measuring when we just ask people whether they believe in God, and I'd like to know more about better ways of measuring belief in God. I'd also like, and this, I'm going to connect these two thoughts on what beliefs are made of and how we measure them, to think a little bit about sequencing of research in psychology of religion. So I see a lot of enthusiasm for studies on what does religion do. So religion as independent variable. Does religion make you more pro-social? Does it make you cheat less? Does it make you happier? Well, I don't know, but in part that's because I'm not sure what the independent variable is. I'm not sure what the religion bit of those research questions is. And even when we break that down to think about religious belief, again, I'm still not sure what that is. And so I think there's a priority to get at these more nuanced questions about the nature of belief. Here's another one. What is religious identity? I like this picture. I think this is from Palmyra in New York. We have 4 different churches on the same crossroads. And sociologists of religion use religious identity as a categorical variable, but religious identity is not a natural kind. So why do we use that as though religious identity were a scientific variable? This is a little strange to me. And so figuring out what's going on in people's minds with regard to identity, importing what we know about the psychology of identity into the study of religious identity, and how religious identities and whatever else is going on there, how that relates back to what people believe, if at all. I've had people who, in my studies, say they're an atheist or an agnostic, but then go on to say, yes, I moderately believe in God. What's going on there? Again, with identity, how do we go beyond comparing group means? Who's a Catholic? What is a mean evangelical? What is that? There's a lot of action, there's a lot of variance there that we often aren't getting to because we aren't thinking about, we're not thinking carefully enough about what we're studying. Maybe even higher level. How do we integrate incoherent theory in this area? I have lots of strands of work, whether it's developmental or social, anthropological, religious studies work, different bodies of theory that aren't talking well to each other, even within one branch of psychology. The people who are doing work on attachment aren't reading the people who are doing work on attribution. That's really strange to me. So how do we, this is a sort of a tactical question, how do we help integrate these different strands of theory? And then how do we make the study of religion also responsive to religion as it is lived? These are just some sort of devotional books about the experience of relating to God. That sort of head-heart distinction that Miguel mentioned gets picked up in the first of those, in knowing God, that you can know a lot about God without having any knowledge of God, that writer puts out. Or you can have lots of kind of false images of God that the second person says there. Are we paying attention to the lived experience of the people we're studying? How can we do that better? How then can we promote interdisciplinary work? It's great to hear that there is an array, a good disciplinary array here in this room. What would it take for you to start doing projects together? I know there's lots of kind of disincentives in the academy to doing good work together, but we're seeing that the best projects and the most productive projects are the ones that involve teams of scholars who are willing to do that hard, heavy lifting to learn each other's languages and compare each other's questions and assumptions and do good multi-method, methodological triangulation, all this stuff that whatever we studied, we probably learned about the value of it and then promptly went off and didn't do it. So how do we make sure that we are working with other people? We can't all be an expert in every method and every discipline, but we can work with those who are. Kind of more of the same. How do we bridge academic silos? These are just some of the specialist journals, never mind the more mainstream journals where it might be more strategic to publish in. This is this array of specialist scientific study of religion journals. It's this proliferation. There's pretty much a new journal every year now. And each one represents a sort of a camp within the scientific study of religion. It's sort of, please don't start any new journals. It's probably not very helpful, and again, it makes it harder for us to be learning from each other. So this last question, how can we encourage more people to study these questions? Offering money may not be enough, it's turning out, because surprisingly, very few people are applying to us to do work on religious cognition. So the one time we put out a specific call, which was this Gods and Minds call that this grant and some of the others represented, here today were a part of. We had a good number of proposals to that, about 140, of which we funded 12. But then we have open submission every year. It varies how many times per year, but oftentimes I have 5. So we're open for business on these sorts of questions all the time. How many minutes do I have left, do you think? I have 0 minutes left. Well, I might stop there. If there's a little time for Q&A. Well, is there something I want to highlight to you? I have a few questions, or a few things about what it takes to apply to JTF, if that would be of interest. But maybe you think it is? Okay, Neil thinks it is, which maybe some of you others do as well. So briefly, we're a large foundation. We're within the 25 largest private foundations in the US, founded by this Wall Street financier, Sir John Templeton, who died in 2008. And here he is again. And there's actually 3 different Templeton Foundations. So we're the John Templeton Foundation. All 3 have the same funding mandate, but the John Templeton Foundation right now is the only one that you can apply to directly. The assets of the foundation, this is just of John Templeton Foundation, have been going up. And so we've had more funding available for scientific study of religion. But that's not all we fund. So we actually fund all sorts of things, from the search for exoplanets to genetically modified crops to character development, free market economics, and all sorts of other things. But a good deal of it is on religion and spirituality, scientific study of those things. And then this is an intersection between the religion and spirituality piece and the psychology and neuroscience piece. So we fund other sorts of psychology and other sorts of studies of religion besides psychology. So here is some, just, not all of you might be interested in religion, you might be interested in something else. This is some of the breadth of things that we are open for proposals on. And we really are interested, focusing in now on the religion and spirituality piece, in the breadth of study of religion and spirituality from a scientific perspective. And without methodological or disciplinary bias. So again, this triangulation is, we're up for that. So I heard somebody say she was from linguistics. We have very little linguistic work coming into us. And I'd be interested in more. Any method goes. Who can apply? Anyone can apply. If you're a postdoc, you can apply. If your institution is happy for you to apply, doesn't matter what country you're in. And you apply by visiting our website, templeton.org. We have a 2-stage funding process. So you write a letter of intent, an online funding inquiry, or OFI, as we call it, which is relatively short and relatively low burden in terms of what you need to do for it compared to a large grant proposal. We reject most of those, but those that we invite through to the 2nd stage, it's a larger proposal, but we end up funding about a half of those. Okay, so the things to think about before you apply to us. First of all, is your idea within donor intent? So I said, anything within religion and spirituality we could be interested in, and that is mostly true, but some things are more interesting than others to us. So there some things are more of a bullseye than others. So this first book, if you wanted to look at something written by Sir John Templeton, he being a billionaire, you can have your own press and you can write your own books, and they always get published. And he has a lot of kind of hypotheses in there. He wasn't a dogmatic guy. He actually raised a lot of questions, and he was interested in people conducting science to test these things out, and other things that he knew that he couldn't conceive of at the time that he wrote these things. There's a lot of questions about why people believe in God, and who believes in God, and actually what are the benefits of believing in God, but again, we can sequence some of these questions. So this first one might be worth looking at. You might then want to think about all the things you should think about with any grant proposal. But especially, just to re-emphasize, integration of ideas with parallel lines of investigation, so teaming up with other people is a good thing. Projects that challenge existing theory and in some way give back to general psychological theory, so the example I gave of work on gratitude to God, why is that interesting? Because we could learn something about general attribution theory. So take your question and think, try and answer the so what question. Where would this go? Why would another psychologist or your discipline insert here? Why would they be interested in this question? Using open science best practices. So do commit in your proposal to pre-register with the Open Science Framework or your pre-registry of choice. Do commit to having open data materials and open access publications. And being ambitious is good. So I can unpack some of these things afterwards. So this is I'm just going to leave this here. I'll come back to it. So our next deadline is August 31. I think we're going to have a lot of interest because our doors have been shut since last year, and we're not sure when our next deadline will be. So I'm sure there will be one. I'm confident there will be one next year. But this is the next one for these online funding inquiries, and these are some of the things that might be of special interest to us. And that is all. Are there questions that I can answer in the minus how many minutes? We have about 7. Okay, great. So yes, are there questions I can help with?
So with that August 31st deadline,
yes.
That's just the OFI, that's just a short.
Right.
Okay. Oh,
yep.
Thanks. That was it.
Did everyone hear that? So that's just the online funding inquiry for the August 31 deadline. Well, if there are no questions, then I will. Yes, Adam.
It's a two-part question.
Okay.
You choose to answer 1, 2, or 0 of the parts. But from the meeting today, is there something that stands out to you as like what we? Let's keep it to 1, because I think ultimately both of these parts, there's really something I'm getting at. Is there something we've arrived at here, or that you see kind of just sub-threshold in our discussions that strikes you as one of, if not kind of the question that needs answering the most, or among the most?
Well, I think it does go back probably to what's the nature of religious belief, and how do we measure those things? And so some of the approaches that people have been taking and talking about today are looking toward that, I think. So doing good cross-cultural work so that we can have more confidence that we're tapping into the same parts of the mind, for want of a better turn of phrase. And then, I mean, some of the discussion, I think people doing this sort of study need help from philosophers probably to get more clarity on what it is that we're talking about when we talk about religious belief, and to think about the parts of belief. So I'd certainly like to see more of those sorts of conversations. It was clear, certainly from the first symposium, that not everyone agreed up there, and that's really good, because it means that people are willing to grapple with the problems that are there, but don't necessarily get an airing in other venues. So, Neil, and then yes, or yeah.
All right, thank you. So one of the questions that came up earlier today in response to surveys about whether you believe God exists was, what do you even mean by God? And I was just thinking now, that's in part a linguistic question, namely, what does the word God even mean? And so I, not because I'm a linguist, but just out of curiosity, is research in linguistics something that the Templeton Foundation funds, and are you interested in it for this next round of priorities?
I would be, especially linguistics work that leads toward empirical hypotheses, or linguistic work that actually is empirical in and of itself. So we have one big linguistics project on evolution-like processes in language change, but it has nothing to do with religion at all. So we'd be interested in some good linguistic work that would connect with, and this is the key thing, I think, that it wouldn't be in its own theoretical and methodological silo, but something that would reach out and connect with and say, and here would be the implications for theory in these other areas. I had one here, and then...
Is it working? Is it?
Yeah.
It's on? Okay, thank you. Well, there are philosophies, all the philosophies deal with these questions and practices like yoga philosophy and Sankhya and Brahma Sutra and all this stuff. Do you consider this?
We have funded work on different contemplative sciences, but we're interested because of our charter, because of Sir John's interest, in funding scientific work that tests out some of the ideas in ancient scriptures and from other sources as well. So certainly the work doesn't have to be about Christianity or monotheistic religion, but we wouldn't fund kind of text work in and of itself, historical work or theological work just in and of itself. We would fund, I have psychology and theology and dialogue here, so this is another arm if there's any theologians in the room. We are interested in how different theologies might dialogue with the scientific study of religion. What are the implications for those theologies, and what might the implications for scientific study of religion be from different theological vantage points?
Well, I am a physicist and I practice transcendental meditation, and they have done some research about consciousness. And
Yes.
do you know about this?
I may know about some of it, but probably not as much as you.
Well, thank you.
Oh, there were one behind you. Okay.
I was just wondering if the study of theology was expansive enough to include a study of the divine, a creator force, going into the pagans, perhaps?
Potentially. There's certainly nothing that would rule it out from our charter. All right.
So, we're almost finished with the program, and so thanks to all of you who've been here all day. It's been very enlivening, enough to sort of keep one engaged throughout an entire day, and we're finishing strong. So it's a real pleasure. It really is for me to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Jordan Grafman. Jordan is Director of Brain Injury Research at the Northwestern University School of Medicine. He's an elected fellow of the American Psychological Association. He's received more awards than I have time to list here, but they include the Defense Meritorious Service Award, the National Institutes of Health Merit Award, the NIH Directors Award. But really, there's not an award that can sum up Jordan's expertise and his interests. Jordan truly is a polymath in the neurosciences. In his more than 450 peer-reviewed articles, almost 500, you can find that his research has yielded major discoveries in essentially every interesting area of human cognition. And that goes from social skills to reasoning to religious belief. And he has been indeed a pioneer in exploring the origins and characteristics of belief in the human brain. He'll be sharing some of that work with us today. But I actually quickly just want to give a quick story. I've known Jordan a long time. I was fortunate enough to work for Jordan many years ago when he was chief of the cognitive neuroscience section at NIH, which is just up the road. And I was a lowly undergraduate volunteer. I learned a lot working with Jordan. But like a lot of students, I graduated college. I still didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I think this story might be particularly interesting to those of us who are interested in studying belief in sort of meaningful coincidences or signs from above, or do things happen for a reason. So, wasn't sure what I wanted to do. Went off to Europe. Miguel mentioned this sort of pilgrimage. These people graduate college and they go around and litter the continent. So I'm bumming around on trains, sleeping under the stars. This goes on for months. My parents are worried, and time goes by. Fun is had, but I don't really get any closer to knowing what I should do next. So the day that I am to leave, I go to the airport, Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. I get there a couple of hours ahead of my flight, and I go to a waiting room in the terminal. It's a big room. It's about the size of this room, and there's only one other human being in that room, and it's Jordan. And so just the only research mentor I've ever had, on a foreign continent, just the two of us. The odds being however many billion to one. Call that a sign, don't call that a sign. I know that Jordan, as an example, as an inspiration, has had a lot to do with my decision to pursue an academic career and to ask big questions. And I know that he's had that same inspirational effect on many, many neuroscientists and neurologists. It's a big family. And so it really is a great pleasure, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Jordan Grafman.
You almost made me cry. Come on. All right. Let me just figure this one thing out. Which button do I push here to get the... Is it working? No. That's to move the slides, right, but I was looking for the laser pointer. Oh, it's the red one. Okay, it's working. Okay, thank you for staying and having me here. I have a different perspective, perhaps, than most of the previous speakers. I was trained as a neuropsychologist, a research neuropsychologist, and my primary interest was in better understanding of the human prefrontal cortex. And hopefully you'll see the connection between my own interests and what led me to get interested in beliefs. Let's see. Oh, it works. Great. So I'm a substitute, right? So Dr. Barrett was supposed to be here and is ill, and so Adam was kind enough to invite me to do the keynote. And that's a quote from a recent paper, well, recent, now it's 6 years old, a 6-year-old paper from Dr. Barrett, and he does talk a little bit about connecting and wondering whether you can connect the cognitive science of religion and cognitive neuroscience. And as I say right now, I sure hope so, because I've dived into that area, and I hope it's a worthwhile swim. So let's move on. So why have I wanted to study belief systems? And here's 3 reasons. And this is sort of a broad definition of belief. It's in small print, I'm sorry, above there. But first of all, because I'm interested in the prefrontal cortex, I have to be interested in human brain evolution, because most people would say that the prefrontal cortex is the most evolved area of the brain in humans. And so you want to know why. And if one of the reasons is that it represents forms of belief there, then you should study it. So that's one reason. I'm interested in how I have a particular slant, a particular point of view, and I think basically the brain re-represents the world. This is my view. It's not a process-oriented view. It is, as I look out among you, you are now represented in my brain in various ways, and somehow everything I do is going to be at least partly dependent on you and partly dependent on the brain. So it's a handshake, and it's differentially weighted depending on what's going on out here or if I'm thinking to myself. In any case, number 2 is important. And third, I deal with patients a lot, patients who have focal brain injuries, and if focal brain injuries affect parts of the brain that I presume represent belief systems, then it's likely that those belief systems may be altered after brain damage. Now, if they're altered, not only will they affect the person who has the brain damage, but they can also affect the family that has to take that person back, particularly if their beliefs have been altered. So I'm interested in that as well. Those are the 3 main driving forces for my research. I'm sure many of you know this, but I'll just go through a quick geography here of areas of interest. This comes from a review paper in Nature Review Neuroscience with some of my postdocs 10, 11 years ago now. So the thing to be interested in for us is the frontal lobes, of course, as I mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, which can be subdivided into subregions. And now, with recent analyses, functional analyses, it's many more than what I'm showing here. These are older depictions based on Brodmann, so-called Brodmann's area and morphological distinctions in the brain. But now it's even more complicated. The anterior temporal lobes is another area that is important, not only because there's structures that are concerned with emotion, but there's also structures that are concerned with the representation of social beliefs out of context, separate by themselves, not including context, based on our research, which I'm not going to talk about today, but we got data for it. Then there's going to be structures that are more midline in the brain that are concerned with emotions. I put a plus the insula. The insula is a hot area if you do cognitive neuroscience research. And it particularly seems important for self-awareness of emotion, not necessarily driving emotion itself. And as an aside, I'm not going to talk about it today, but compared to structures that modulate empathy, it turns out the insula is more important for altruistic behavior. Okay, and finally, there's areas, excuse me, we'll get to that in a second. There are areas in the brain that are concerned with reward. That is, if you do an action, what's going to motivate you to do it again? What's going to reinforce that behavior? And we have structures within the brain that are concerned with reward and reinforcement, and they ought to be important for studying beliefs as well. And we have areas of the brain that are concerned with hormones that allow you to bond more closely with others. So we heard a lot about in-groups and out-groups. Well, certainly within in-groups, does the word oxytocin ring a bell? Because oxytocin is one of those structures that are, one of those hormones that seem to be really important for social bonding. Now, as I mentioned these, I'm not going to get back to this too much, but clearly predisposition for some of these behaviors and for some of this neural activity is going to involve genetics. And we have I'll have more or less the same genes, but we may have different polymorphisms, different versions of those genes. You may have some different than me. That may bias us towards different kinds of social behavior. So it's good to know about that. And on top of that, if you're involved in some environmental experience that changes you, then the study of epigenetics, that is, how can you change the genes' instructions to your behavior based on some experience? So again, another aside, we've studied aggression in patients. And if they have a particular MAO gene, in the general population, you're much more likely to be aggressive. But it turns out that if you come from a good environment, you're not more likely to be aggressive. So the environment, in some way, changes the genetic predisposition towards that behavior. So it's complicated, but it's something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so these are the structures that are important, and then by reverse inference, that is, we know a lot about these areas of the brain, not everything, but a lot, we can go back and think about what those areas of the brain are important for. So we know that the frontal lobe is concerned with complex, long-duration, multi-stage events. In the medial part of the frontal lobe, we know that those kinds of events tend to be routines, overlearned, and overbehaved activities. And we know if it's more dorsal, they tend to be more unfamiliar and less structured. And we also know that the ventral or orbital part of this lobe has a lot to do with your own social behavior as an agent, and therefore emotions attached to that behavior. And the more superior parts of the frontal lobe seem to be involved with your observations of others. And if you're right in the middle is where you have a mapping between somebody else's behavior and your own. It makes sense structurally to do it that way. And of course, we have, as I mentioned, we have structures concerned with motives, and then this kind of behavior can influence perception. So you have to consider even the more basic elements of cognition, even when you're studying higher order beliefs. It's sort of the idea that if you have a stereotype and you're a cop and you see a black person and they're holding a bar of soap in their hands, are they more likely to see that as a weapon than a bar of soap? And the answer has been, yeah, that's the case. So all those structures are important, and here's just a very dumb, simple example. If you're concerned about predicting the future of an orphan child, how these different regions work together to produce your compassion. So it's way too complicated, really, in some sense. So the studies I'm going to quickly describe today, I'm going to just focus on some snapshots from some of our published research that looks at moral and religious beliefs. I'm going to include imaging studies, a PET imaging study, which is a resting study of functional activity in the brain, an fMRI study, which required people to make judgments, and patient studies, where we're looking at the site of lesion and the amount of lesion to make predictions about behavior that we studied. We try to utilize normative data. That is, for example, in the case of philosophy, something studied in the context of moral behavior is the trolley car problem. I don't like the trolley car problem. I want to get at, it's not that it's not bad, but it's a reasoning problem because most people have never been in that position. Now, there is an exception today, and I've tried to get these people to study, and these are drone operators. So drone operators are the modern version, I think, of the trolley car problem, but there's not just one decision maker there, right? You have to go through a series of decisions in order to decide whether to fire a drone or not. But in any case, those are exceptional situations. So I'm much more interested in common everyday life experiences. And that's what, so we try to utilize normative data, and then we try to understand the structure of that data before we administer it to patients. And these are basically simple studies. We just ask people to say whether they agree with a statement or not in most cases, or they have to make a multiple choice. Very simple sorts. So how we pick our statements turns out to be obviously important, and potential to criticize. So if you're interested in knowledge representation, you want to always understand whether the knowledge is distinctly represented in the brain or not. That's whether it's words, objects, or in this case, beliefs. So that's something we try to study. So I'm just going to give you an example from a couple of studies of moral beliefs we've done, and then I'm going to move on to some of the studies of religious belief. So we'll start with a simple one, and it's when I want to say one more thing. So if I criticized the trolley car problem, what did we do? So we collaborated with Ralph Adolphs, who's at Caltech. He had a grad student, and she collected diaries and experiences and probed people in the Pasadena, California region about experiences that then they could decide whether they were fit under the category of moral behaviors. And these were people from the community, not Caltech students. And we took those, and then, because sometimes they were pages, these experiences and events that people described to us, and we thought we were going to use them for neuroimaging or for other purposes, and you need to make them shorter, a lot shorter. So we condensed them. And then we did a variety of principal components and other kinds of analyses. And here's another one of the problems, for us anyway, deciding what to do. The problem is you actually get a whole bunch of dimensions and main components. When people have to do and you could do there's a variety of ways to do this, multidimensional scaling, factor analyses, there's lots of ways to do this. The problem is not every situation requires all these components or dimensions, and some experiences or situations that you present to people, these will have different weightings depending on the task. So it gets really complicated, particularly if you're interested in context, because context can change not just from country to country, but in some, like in Chicago, crossing a street can provide a different context in a different neighborhood. So anyway, this is just a warning to us that this is complex stuff, and you have to do this kind of analysis ahead of time, I think, before you start using stimuli like this in experiments, especially if it's at the level of belief. So we decided to study what we called other critical or pro-social moral beliefs. And we decided to study these in patients who have frontotemporal dementia and compare them to healthy controls. We used everyday sentiments, everyday experiences that people might have. And in this case, we used PET scanning, positron emission tomography scanning, to give a sense of the functional activity of a brain area, not simply look at its atrophy. If you've never seen or understood, frontotemporal dementia is particularly prominent in people in their 50s as opposed to Alzheimer's disease. And if you look here, you can see there's a ribboning. This is an example of the prefrontal cortex. So if you think beliefs are, that the prefrontal cortex is important for beliefs representation and behavior, these are patients that you could study. And often, especially in the early stages, they can certainly take all the kinds of tests you can throw at them. So we decided to use a test that we had developed, the moral sentiments test. And this is an example of some of the items from there. For example, your mom called you and said she didn't feel well. You ignored her, and the next day she died. My mom called me one day, and she was aphasic on the phone, and I called 911 and got an ambulance there, and she lived. So this can happen to you. And if you don't take it seriously, of course, you can feel guilty or pity, or there's a variety of sentiments that might be associated with that and some of the other items. And so they had to choose the appropriate sentiment. This is a decrease in PET metabolism. So in essence, this is not good. And these are the areas that are most affected in frontotemporal dementia. So you can see they're mostly in the frontal lobes and in the anterior temporal lobes. Those very areas that seem important for beliefs. Patients who had performed on this test performed much less accurately than the healthy controls. So we wanted to know, by using the scanning, whether we could correlate areas in the brain that showed less functional activity with specific aspects of these statements, like whether they were more associated with pro-social or with other critical. So in general, if you just combine the scores, these are the areas that show the less activity, and they're associated with the task performance in general, the range of performance on that task. However, if you look at the pro-social items and that particular subset of items, now the areas are the frontopolar cortex and the septum. So those were correlated, associated, by and large, and particularly the subset of items concerning prosocial behavior with those two regions. If you looked at other critical, you had different brain regions, including more medial. Remember I said the medial prefrontal cortex is concerned with judging the world more, and here's an example of that. Or disgust, and the amygdala was highly activated in the anterior temporal lobe. So in this is just one way to do something. You can take functional imaging. You can look at disparities in performance on subsets of a task, if you subdivide in any way you want. And then you can find specific regions that might be relevant for performance of that scale or those items. This is something that's submitted. This is the only thing I'm going to present that we've submitted. And we had a Machiavellian scale, which you might argue that Machiavellianism is characterized by distrust, deception, and exploiting. Might remind you of, I suppose we all know some people, or there are public figures that might get that definition. So we're interested. So in this case, now we're switching the population. In this case, and for many of the other studies I'm going to describe, I am studying Vietnam veteran combat veterans with penetrating brain injuries. So at the time they're doing these studies, they're in their 60s, and they come from the population at large. They're mostly white. They're all males, all males. Here's an example of the scales we use that can be divided into items concerned with tactics and items concerned with views, Machiavellian views. It's, we think, a standard scale. Maybe you could tell me if it's not. But when we see people, they come in for a week. We test them for 40 hours. So these guys are bonding to us, and they volunteer. So we have an incredible amount of data on them. So empathy tests, theory of mind, verbal fluency, card sorting, education, whether they have post-traumatic stress disorder. We have pre-injury data on them, so we can try to rule those out in some way as contributing, besides the lesion, to the performance we're seeing. And these are lesion maps. So that's where the brain injuries are from these penetrating missile wounds. So you can divide people up into left and right, for example, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, or patients with posterior lesions. And particularly if you have a hypothesis that's driving this, why not? So there's been some literature on Machiavellianism and describing that as being more prominent in case of activation studies when the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is activated. So this is a bad figure, and I'm sorry about this, but the bottom line is if you had left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, you had a tendency to become more Machiavellian in your endorsement of statements that reflected that. And it turned out to be only for views, but not for tactics. So again, there's another reason to subdivide, to fractionate these scales and items. And we are able to, as I mentioned, we're able to control, in this case, for emotional intelligence. We have a big battery of that, linguistic abilities, empathy, and psychopathology. So this holds up even when you control for all those other performance measures. So clearly, if you do this kind of study and you use cognitive neuroscience methods, we realize quite quickly that aspects of moral judgment and Machiavellian tendencies are reflected in the performance or the activation of specific brain regions that, when damaged, change your performance on these tasks in certain directions. They tend to be in those areas I talked about in the beginning of the talk, and none of these areas are only involved with these moral processes, which is another point, if you're interested in distinguishing brain areas. So we became interested in studying religious beliefs, partly because we had studied economic beliefs, legal beliefs, political beliefs, and moral beliefs, and sort of what was left in some sense. And if you're interested in the function of the prefrontal cortex and evolution in humans, you have to study this stuff. Because I don't know about any of you, I have a couple of dogs. They don't show this behavior to me, even through their smell. I mean, I can't see it. And it's hard to see in other species, and it's hard to get their explicit agreement on this as well. So in any case, we decided to study this. And historically, clearly, because of the nature of this belief system, there's been some thought that there is a special kind of representation in the human brain. So we were interested in seeing whether we could demonstrate that or not. We cannot study, in our lab anyway, supernatural phenomena. Now you can do, you can get magicians to come in and they have ways of demonstrating very unusual tricks that sometimes fall under that category. You can do perceptual distortions, you can induce them. That's another way to do this kind of thing. But these are not the kind of supernatural events I would have been interested in. No, we can't really do that. And I have had a lot of trouble recruiting God to come into the lab. So it's a real problem. So we tend to study combat veterans, healthy volunteers, et cetera. This is one of the first studies we did. It was a neuroimaging study, and one of the nice things was it got into proceedings of the National Academy of Science to show that these kinds of efforts can be legitimized in quote-unquote hard science journals. It's good to try to get into those. I'm just going to give you a snapshot from this. We took items from the Baylor University. They do surveys. We borrowed their surveys, and then we had people do multidimensional scaling. Sort of relate to do that. You have similarities and distinctions between all possible items. It takes a long time to do this. The volunteers are particularly devoted. And then you look at correlations between the dimensions and some other measure. And so we were able to come up, based on that survey, with these basically 3 or 4 items: God's level of involvement, God's emotion, religious knowledge, and then subdividing that into experience or doctrinaire knowledge. It was an fMRI experiment. Our subjects had to agree or disagree with statements. It was composed of people who had both religious belief and who described themselves as atheists. There was no difference whatsoever in the brain activity patterns we saw between those two, just to mention that. And so this particular question is, what happens when the beliefs are associated with an authoritarian figure? The activation pattern you can see up here. Here are the structures that were activated. And these are structures that have been consistently activated in studies of theory of mind. As we said, in other words, God's just another guy to people when they use their brain regions to try to process this information. So by analogy, or however they're thinking about it, they have to use the components of cognitive processing that they've used for common everyday experiences to determine the intent of somebody else, So that was our finding there. That's one kind of finding. Here's another finding. What happens when somebody who has strong religious belief is reading one of these statements that contradicts their religious belief? And what we found was that the insula, that structure I mentioned before, was quite activated, as was the cingulate gyrus, which is, I don't know if you can see it quite well there. It's more or less around here in the frontal lobes. And the cingulate gyrus is often activated during situations of conflict. Now, although we didn't do this in this study, we've done another study with looking at political beliefs, and just simply reading a statement that agrees with your political belief activates structures that are rewarding or reinforcing. You don't even have to be thinking of whether you like it or not. You're just simply reading the statement. And so you wonder why people go back to the same newspapers or go back to the same kinds of texts. It's rewarding when it's attached to the belief system they come into the readings with. So we've done a couple of other, I have a lot of religious data on our Vietnam veterans, and we've just scratched the surface, really, of studying them. And most of these studies, we were greatly helped. We heard about collaboration, why it's important, by Joseph Bobulia from New Zealand. And we continue to work with him on these projects. So we wanted to study mysticism and fundamentalism. I'm interested in mysticism because I've had 2 mystical experiences in my life. I'll tell you one now, and I'll save the other one to the end. So the first mystical experience happened after my mom died. So there's a lot of rituals you go through if you're Jewish after a parent dies or somebody else you know dies. And on top of that, I get to work at 4:30 in the morning to avoid rush hour, to be back at the time with my sons. I just wanted to spend time with them. So I'm walking down this street towards Old Georgetown Road. You know where I was at the NIH then. And I look across the street. This is about a week after my mom died. And I look across the street, and there's my mom. I mean, that is my mom. So I look away because it's a little shocking, I think. It's disturbing. It's disturbing. I didn't want to go across the street. I thought it was a little odd. I look back, she's gone. Now I think, you're a scientist. You think, okay, I'm thinking about her all the time. I'm projecting this. This is sort of like it's 4:30 in the morning. I probably should be dreaming. There's lots of, but I try to look and see if there was just somebody going. There was a nursing home down the street there, and is there somebody I just missed to look? No, there was nobody there that I could see. So it's a conflicting experience when you do research, and at the same time you have this. Now, it was my mom. It wasn't some supernatural figure, but it was unusual. and mystical for me. But that's not why we did this. But that is one experience. I'll tell you about another one. So this has been published, and we took a scale. Well, first of all, these are our Vietnam veterans again, and we asked them about this information. They often asked us, why are we, I'm glad all your participants are just willing to volunteer. We got a lot of questions from ours. Why do we want to know this? And this reflects, I think, a general issue in how far we proceed along this path before we start getting pushback, that we don't want to be seen like social engineers. This is what we're going to hear about. So anyway, thank you. 15 more minutes. Appreciate that. So this is the scale we used. And there's some reversals there that give you your total score. You can read some of the items. And basically, this is what we found. If you had a lesion in this region of the brain, this is just sort of a more continuous, here's where we did a dichotomous look at the scale. It really doesn't matter. You can see that injuries to the prefrontal cortex, polar cortex, are particularly important here. And what it means is you're going to be more likely to have a mystical experience if you've had a lesion there. Remember, they had lesions here between the ages more or less of 18 and 22, and now they're 60 years old. So as far as we could ascertain, the experiences that they were endorsing came after their injury and before, of course, when we studied them. And this is just another look at the data. And we did some further analysis, and it turns out that if they had right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex lesions, they were much more likely to have a higher experience or endorsement of mystical experiences. If they had temporal lobe lesions, they were less likely. And so if you think of a stream of processing from visual cortex forward, many of the ways that we interpret what we see in the world, in the environment, requires context. And if you have damage to an area that restricts or diminishes your ability to place context on experience, you may be more likely to misinterpret that perceptual experience in some ways. And vice versa. You're much less likely, potentially, to have a sense of mysticism, or at least endorse mystical experiences, if you have temporal lobe lesions, because context overwhelms, in some way, perception. You know, it's sort of like, you'll see this in a little bit. So here's a study we did more recently on fundamentalism, and using a fundamentalism scale that comes out of the religion literature. And this just tells you the groups here. This is just defining the groups of patients. So this is our ventromedial prefrontal cortex group, a little bit lower down. This is dorsolateral, and this is no prefrontal cortex lesion. This study is going to give us another dilemma that I'll talk to you about in a minute. So in this case, frontal lobe lesions, particularly in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, but also in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, made you more likely to have higher at least self-report, higher fundamentalism. Now, it turns out that in the case of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, those results occur, we interpret, because the lesion affects the representation of the beliefs in the brain. It doesn't wipe out the entire ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So just as if you were trying to, so in the case of people who have aphasia, if they have language areas affected and they try to retrieve words, they're much more likely to retrieve high frequency words, words that they've used a lot, etc. So you could make potentially the same interpretation here, that they are still have access to the more conservative aspects of the belief representation, and therefore that's why ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions affect that. But that's not the case for dorsolateral lesions. Dorsolateral lesions effects on fundamentalism are mediated, if you do a mediation analysis, by these aspects of personality: cognitive flexibility or openness. So if you're less open and less flexible, you're more likely to report higher fundamentalist, you're more likely to endorse statements concerned with fundamentalism. It just shows that different areas of the brain contribute in different ways, potentially, to the same task. And so you always have to be aware of that. And then on top of that, there are mediating variables that are of interest. And so this is becoming much more common now in psychology and cognitive science anyways, to do mediation analyses, as long as you have the proper measures to do those analyses with. Okay, so I want to summarize our results. At least in our hands, at least using the approach we take, which is to basically look at endorsements or not of statements concerned with various aspects of religious belief, we know that some areas of the brain appear more critical for this. And it turns out that those areas are also important for social cognition and cognitive control and inhibition. We also know that if you're doing activation studies or even lesion studies, that the profile of areas in the brain that you think are important are going to depend on the weightings of the subcomponents of the tasks that you presented to people. So of course you need multiple tasks and multiple contexts to get a complete picture of this dynamic brain, even in the case of studying religious beliefs. Simply reading statements contradictory, as I mentioned before, simply reading statements evokes brain activity in areas that perhaps ordinarily you'd want to at least modulate more carefully, but they're not. I mentioned the mystical experiences data and the fundamentalism data results already. So, at least in our hands, and maybe you think it's stating the obvious, but it doesn't hurt to state the obvious sometimes. There's no specialized God spot in the human brain. So that already narrows, at least as far as we can tell anyway, that narrows the kinds of conclusions you want to make about representation of religious beliefs. And there doesn't seem to be any dedicated brain networks that are uniquely devoted to these kinds of representations, which means it's important to know the literature at large to make interpretations about what you get when you do specific studies about specific belief systems. Some of this requires, unless you have a lot of data, and that's hard to get with functional imaging data, but it's not, you can get that if you do lesion studies. Of course, it's important to provide convergent evidence, not from one kind of technique, not from one kind of population. Convergence gives you strength in your findings, and I think it's really important. But in any case, there doesn't seem to be brain networks. You can use a lot of reverse inferences, or you can use control conditions that will demonstrate that. And it's also clear that within brain networks, the hubs of those networks are in the prefrontal cortex primarily and the anterior temporal lobes. Another thing that's important is that the brain and the representations in the brain, at least this is our belief, also helps sculpt how the brain evolves. So the fact that religion and religious beliefs are part of the brain also means it influences perception and other aspects of brain functioning. So it's powerful and important, and not some trivial sociological object of study. It really, we need to do more studies of religion and the brain, because it really shaped who we are as humans, I think. There are numerous variables. Here's an example of some of them. I'm just repeating what I said before. It's important to know whether the stimulus represents a personal or social norm violation. They're not always the same. They're not always the same. They're distinctions. Sentiments or dimensions characterize how people feel about a belief. The deferred to authority can be God, or it can be a political authority, an economic authority, a moral authority, a legal authority. Does their task require, well, you already heard this already today, explicit and implicit processing may affect brain activity differentially. And is the participant familiar with the belief? And how do you define familiar? It's also important to me, as I mentioned before, if you see a patient and you have to talk to the family about the consequences of brain damage, whether they be a neurodegenerative disease or a focal lesion, a stroke, any one of those things, often this topic is never brought up because it's not studied or evaluated. Just as a quick aside, how many minutes? 5 minutes, good, I'm there. A quick aside is I wanted to develop, because I think it's really important, a social cognition battery that could be commercially So I went to one of the companies, and they told me they didn't want to touch it in the current political climate. So this is a dangerous area to investigate up after a point. You know, there's going to be a threshold after which you're, I wouldn't say trampling on people's beliefs, but it has to be handled sensitively. And so we think it's important in order to inform families, if not the patient, that there could be changes in belief systems following brain damage. These are questions I have. I've heard some answers to it already here today, so I'm happy. So we tend to study people from the community, not college students and not priests, not rabbis, and not imams. I mean, we are studying the average person. If you're interested in, for example, how people process orthography, the shape of words, the shape of letters, well, I've had students in the past who studied people who delivered a mail. They're really good at it. And you can get, it's expertise. If you're interested in reasoning, maybe you want to study, you know, people who do that for a living and not simply the average person. But there's probably going to be differences in performance and outcomes and brain areas if you study one versus the other. And my suspicion is that most of the people we study, and we have some of this data already, have very shallow understanding of, including even remembering what's in biblical texts, for example. So how they get their religious beliefs and how they practice it and what they remember is going to be a critical issue, at least in cognitive neuroscience. It's already an issue for you guys. I'm very interested in cross-prime. If belief systems are not distinguished very easily from each other, then how you prime, there ought to be priming. You ought to be able to prime religious beliefs, perhaps, with political beliefs. You ought to make people faster in responding in some way. But then you have to control the items. You have to build them, and then you have to norm them before you can say they're equivalent in various aspects, psychometric aspects of the stimuli. So I think that's important because they ought to be represented in the same way that we represent words or objects. There are plenty of metrics that you can use for each one of those kinds of stimuli to predict what's going to be retrieved and how fast it's going to be retrieved. It's valuable to have metrics when you're using stimuli. And we've already heard, and I just mentioned, that clearly beliefs modulate in very specific ways perceptual experience, even in a normal day. We ought to also be interested in some way in people, I didn't hear that example today, but who responds to placebos and who and which people don't. Belief is important in medicine, of course, and this is one example. If you have placebo versus not taking something, placebo seems to be more effective. Placebo. So, just a few more points here. I would love, and we had a little bit of conversation about this at dinner, to study conversion. People who believed firmly in one thing now believe firmly in another thing, and I'd like to see what the brain areas look like. We know, for example, if you learn languages at the same time, they intersect in the brain in the same regions. Say, if you learn them in a sequential manner, they're compound representations. Would you find that for beliefs? Does it matter for beliefs? I mean, if I go to a South American country, maybe I'm going to struggle, but I'm going to speak Spanish. If I go to a South American country, I'm not going to convert to Catholicism, for example, if it's one of the Catholic countries. So different representations have different uses, different needs, and may be represented differentially depending on such things. And as I mentioned before, how can we manage to study this without antagonizing people? We heard a little bit about the media. A lot of our studies get a lot of media attention, and they're often erroneous these days. I mean, they don't even hear what I'm saying to them. On the other hand, they pay our salaries through grants, and they're the citizenry we actually want to engage. So, and these days in the internet, you have no control. No control. So you just have to be more tolerant, and you have to inhibit a little bit. And if it gets into the right, unfortunately, the media, this is probably going to be the only thing I would agree with Trump on, I think. The media has cheapened itself incredibly, and it's gone towards surface features, emotions, and things like that, rather than, with some exceptions, rather than deep knowledge. So. And deep deliberation. So it's partly the messenger that's the problem here. So we have a book that we edited, Frank Kruger and I, if you're interested in our perspective and the perspective of others about cognitive neuroscience approaches to belief. And now I'm going to tell you the last mystical experience I had, and then I'm done. So I'm from Chicago. I'm back in Chicago after many years here. And this is, in fact, this is me as a kid wearing a Cubs hat. This is if you're not from here, it's a baseball team, and it's the north side of Chicago. And at the time, I'm smiling here, and even here, they had not won a World Series for close to a century. Why am I smiling? Why did I even believe in a team that never won? I had a belief. I believed they were going to win, but there was no history to indicate that was going to happen. So it's not a rational belief, and in this year it was counterfactual. This was from an ESPN interview they did with. Somehow they called me because I wrote a chapter on the social cognition of Cubs fans that got some attention. Okay, so they won the World Series last year. When they won so here's the experience I had. When they won the pennant, I'm at home, I'm in bed, and I'm watching the game. It's not the series, it's just the pennant. They win the pennant, and all this emotion comes out, and out of the left side, I see a color, like a brown color, like not an attractive color, leave my body. Now I have a cracked retina, so I can't see very well on this side, okay? But I can see perfectly well on this side. And out comes this thing. It was as if something was expunged from my body when this happened. I'm going to confess here. You can hear my confession. When I was much younger, it's true, I took some hallucinogenic drugs. And this is much younger. I'm not doing that anymore. There was a comparison between an experience I had then on drugs when I was very young, 45 years earlier, and what happened to me that night. So and in the case with my mother, and that was another mystical event, I knew what my mother looked like, and I knew what she looked like more or less at the age I saw her across the street. So these were two events that were unusual, but no doubt were somewhere in my memory. So why again, this is the scientist trying to dampen some sort of supernatural story. So, last slide. This is from Proverbs, from the Torah, from the Old Testament. And it's really kind of except for one sentence, it's kind of cool, I think. It encourages learning and wisdom. But there's one sentence here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. There's a little bit of a threat, even when you want to learn something, that if you don't do this, God's not going to like it. He's not going to like it. And so it makes you, now we haven't done these kinds of studies yet, but it makes me, that's why I asked the question earlier this morning about enforcement. And I should have added by a deity or by a religious organization that says this is the way you do something, and even something that looks really good here. I mean, it really looks encouraging. Even there, at that time, somebody felt if they didn't say that, even if, let's say from the moment they believed or they didn't believe, the writer believed or didn't believe, let's be cynical. They didn't believe in God necessarily, but they wanted to use this as a control mechanism, a way to enforce something that wasn't happening on a routine basis. There's no other reason to do this. There's no other reason to have that kind of statement unless people were not cooperative. So does religion have a value? That tells me it does in some respects, that sometimes you require something above and beyond your, you'd like to say, well, atheists can do this and all that. Well, there weren't too many atheists back then, probably, my guess is. They had many different forms of belief. This was just one of them. So, yeah, I think it's important. I'd like to study that more in people, and I haven't done that. So thank you for inviting me. I hope this wasn't too boring. I hope it gives you a perspective on how you approach these things from a cognitive neuroscience point of view. It's a little bit out of left field, to use a baseball metaphor, but I think you're going to find, like in the case of political beliefs and legal beliefs and other moral beliefs, that there's going to be a whole rush of people who do cognitive neuroscience research into religious beliefs. So thanks for having me. Sure. Anybody want chat or have an argument or? No? Oh, yes.
Thank you for your interesting talk. I've worked a long time in the third world, and businessmen insist that literacy will make a worker better. Should I repeat it all?
I heard you.
Okay. Will literacy make a worker better? Now, these are illiterate workers, and all they're going to do is, for instance, sew the same kind of collar on the same kind of shirt 1,000 times, or pull a lever when a toy comes by and it does something. So they're doing extremely rudimentary work. But the businessmen think there's a big difference between hiring a literate versus illiterate person. Is that substantiated by work on the brain?
Actually, although I haven't done these studies myself, a colleague of mine from Lisbon, a neurologist there, Alexander Castro-Caldas, has studied people in the south of Portugal, where apparently there's a population of people who are illiterate. So you'd have to look up those studies. My guess is if literacy implies that you're going to be able to represent more knowledge in the brain, that is not simply from word of mouth, but now you can explore texts and other references, then it's likely to make a difference here. It's likely to make a big difference, depending, of course, on what they read, right?
But most of us know we don't read manuals when you get something.
Well, what was the first text, right? It's what we're talking about, the Bible, right? It was the first published printable document, at least aspects of it. So it obviously, there are things people would rush towards. Maybe they want to read Pulp Fiction. You never know. But it does give them the opportunity, like you were suggesting, I think, it gives people the opportunity. And yes, you would find with illiterate versus literate, I bet, we'll see. Some of the studies are being done. But you might find differences between how information is represented cognitively, and then subsequently, if you're doing brain imaging studies in any way, then you might find that as well. Yeah, we know language is important.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. As I was listening to you, I was remembering a book that Patrick McNamara wrote, in Neuroscience of Religious Experience. And I was just wondering if you're familiar with his work and his theory or his proposal that religious rituals and religious experiences help to decenter and then recenter the self, the way the self is represented in the brain, and strengthen the executive functions.
Sure. How can you help but agree with, you have to agree with that. It's your identity. So if people ask you, when you get to know somebody, eventually, they want to figure out what you believe in, right? I mean, maybe at a shallow relationship, people don't get into that, but eventually they do. So when you say what you believe in, don't you start talking a little bit about belief in God and religion and other aspects of belief we've been talking about, or if you're an atheist, why you're an atheist? So it's got to be a key part of our identity. Yeah, I mean, how can you disagree with that? That's
Thank you.
a no-brainer, as they say.
If I can ask a second question that has to do with the experiences that you related. I'm thinking about some Native American traditions and ancient ways of understanding, like the vision quest, where you actually provoke some of these experiences, and then you have a framework to interpret the experiences. So sometimes we lack the grammar to understand what is it that we're seeing. But from a scientific perspective, how can you differentiate, if at all, between an illusion and a perception in that setting, in that context?
Yeah. Do you have that experience when you dream a little bit sometimes? Do you know you're in a dream or not? Sometimes, you're living through it. I think that can be difficult. You can, as I mentioned before, there are certainly ways to produce illusions in the lab. You can do that. There are tricks that you can perform, and there are perceptual aberrations that you can induce through your manipulation of stimuli, either on a computer or in a room, in fact. So you can do that and then ask people look at distances in belief, whether it's real or not. I mean, that's perfect. You're perfectly capable of doing that. And then make inferences about how that impacts upon whether you believe in God or not, or other aspects of belief. So yeah, and we heard examples of that, in fact, with the physics belief that we were looking at, whether hitting a ball impacts the other ball. So you can do that in various ways. My own interest happens to be not in, I'm interested in essence, in the semantics of belief and how they're represented in the brain, because I'm so heavily indebted to my belief about representation, what the brain's for. And as I said earlier, I think it's to take the world and put it inside us so we can navigate through the world. It's real simple thought. It's not complex. You can model it, of course. There are lots of ways to do it, but that's basically what I aim at.
I was wondering if, in this large sample of bonded veterans, you've ever asked them if they've had a vision.
If they've had what?
Vision or mystical experiences.
I would say we gave them, the answer is yes. Good. But we haven't gotten to it yet because we have
so much. You have the data, but you haven't analyzed it.
We have tons of data. I mean, many more data sets many more tasks than what I just showed. Yeah. So slowly, first of all, you have to find a postdoc who's interested enough to do this, because is this going to be a good career move for them or not? That is, in most psychology departments, it's pragmatic, You're
talking academia.
Yeah. It can be problematic. So you're welcome.
Hi, thanks. So I was interested especially, in a lot of things, but for this question I was interested in when you were having people read text that conflicts with their beliefs, and in particular their religious beliefs. And I was wondering if you compared that sort of task with reading things that you're highly confident about, but they're not identity constituting. So if I read the sentence, Atlanta is not in Georgia, dogs don't have fur.
Yeah.
Right. So just really mundane things that they're wrong.
Yeah.
Do you get the same pattern in response to those kind of conflicts, or a different one in your scans?
We haven't looked at that exactly, but another thing we do is reasoning. So we have a lot of reasoning studies, and we've looked at the role of emotion in processing sort of reasoning tasks. And in our hands anyway, if you have ventral medial, lower down, right above the eyes, prefrontal cortex lesions, then you're not going to do a very good job of emotional filtering, and that confuses reasoning, right? Which means that the frontal lobe is also important in some sense for modulating the effect of emotion on sort of tasks that are a little bit more complicated. But what we'd have to do in that case, right, was to norm both kinds of stimulus sets, make them equally difficult through psychometric manipulations, and then present them. And anybody here who does that at all when they do studies knows it's incredibly time intensive, because you always fail the first go around, and the second go around you have to substitute statements, there's a lot of things you have to do, and this is an old story. This is an old story from the guy, Lauren Chapman was one of my advisors at Wisconsin, and he did develop scales of magical ideation and a whole bunch of different scales. And he used to study schizophrenics, and this was a big thing, that the task, you wanted to find double dissociations, and there did well on this, not well on this, another group did well on this, not well on this. But in order to do that, you have to build your tasks very carefully. This was a big issue for a while in cognitive and neuropsychology, and I'm sure people quickly realized that this is so time, you have to put so much time, they stopped doing it. So people now report, even, the tasks we use, they're not equated. So if they do well on one and not well on the other, we hope we're getting, that's why you want convergent evidence. We hope and replication. Replication within social, it wasn't mentioned here today, but replication in social psychology is not really good. And it's a big problem in psychology. It's not really good. We're all scared. Anybody who does this kind of work, it gets you a little scary. And big numbers don't necessarily protect you in that case. In any case, I'd love to do more stuff like that, but you need an army of undergraduates, basically, to help you. And I don't have it where I am.
I had one observation and a question. The observation is about Machiavellianism. There is a literature on Machiavellian intelligence, almost exclusively working with monkeys, apes, and fish.
Fish.
Yeah.
What kind of fish?
Sorry?
What kind of fish?
That's a
Do you
good
remember?
question. I
Oh,
haven't
okay.
read the
All right,
fish. I've read the
Okay.
monkeys and apes.
I'm just curious, you know.
So that's almost with animals. The question I have is, in your work, are you finding that emotions are always involved with beliefs?
I would say emotions are always involved with anything we do. So why would beliefs be an exception? So having said that, though, we, as I said, we got these guys for a week. We have a big battery of emotion processing tests, and we can look at subsets of those, the whole thing, and we want to rule it out. We want to say what areas are important when you get rid of other areas that we know contribute to the performance, but if we're interested in the essential representation, I don't want to be confused by those other processes. So we have enough data that we can sort of covary them out. There are other ways to do this, and so yes, the answer is yes, but I want to know what happens without that contribution also. Okay, it's late. I think there is one? Did somebody have one?
Sorry, I thought there was one.
I didn't see one. Oh, go ahead.
Well, to kind of play off of your scripture here, perhaps you could say the fear of replication is the beginning of all wisdom.
I like that.
But if I can wax just a little bit neurotheological here, we're doing some studies on religious authority and demonstrating effects where out-group religious authority figures trigger more amygdala response than in-group authority figures. And here, particularly in Old Testament verses, when the word the Lord is a King James English translation of the Tetragrammaton, which was a proper name of the Hebrew God, that perhaps you could think of it as just like, with an out-group authority figure who's triggering that amygdala fear response, that, okay, don't know who this person is, but that fear of them is the beginning of accessing whatever wisdom that they might have to transfer. So perhaps there's a little bit more of a gracious neural interpretation for that.
Yes. So in that case, do you mean they fear this figure, this authority, but they know nothing about that authority? Or do they then make inferences in their mind about the characteristics of that authority by inferring what they know about that particular in-group or out-group in their case? Do you know, has that been looked at? Because that would make a big difference, obviously. The status of their knowledge about either the religious culture that the authority came from or the authority itself.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding your question correctly, and this was a Mormon population in particular, and they had very little knowledge of the out-group figures, such as Desmond Tutu, little specific knowledge about Pope Francis.
Yeah.
And so there was a correspondence with having a low amount of knowledge about the outsider and having an increased amygdala response to them.
But they knew something in that case, perhaps. Well, I don't know if they knew anything about South African religious practice, but let's say in the case of the Pope, they might have known something about Catholics and how Catholics treated them, and they might have stereotypes about Catholics, and then they use that inference to the authority. So they might have gone at it with some knowledge. But you're right, in groups and out groups, big deal in everything. Even with oxytocin, makes a difference. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Hi. Many of us probably have lost our voices. Some eyes, are doing a brave job of staying open at this time of day. I know how that goes. I've lectured at this time of day. So, no judgment. But this has been, in spite of, its length and density, really, I hope to some of you, certainly to me, very exciting, very sort of enlivening. I'm walking away with several new ideas, new questions, and I think that was the hope. That no one among us thinks we're at best we're at the beginning, and I think that's been said a few times. And I think it's one thing to just say that, and it's another thing to start to identify at least the outlines of the really important sort of research gaps. And I think some of that has manifested today. And so I'm very happy about that. And again, thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to all of our speakers. And a huge thanks again to the Templeton Foundation for making this project, but the greater context in which this project exists, possible. So that's my bit. I'll hand it off to Ali now.
Thank you very much for participating. And in terms of the future, we're looking for something very tangible. And what you're going to receive is an email asking for abstracts with a deadline. That's very tangible. Thank you very much. Right.